tradition as well, with the rise of Black Power and other movements that, Stokely Carmichael and Jesse Jackson both talk about natural law, but without the full content of the tradition, without an account of human nature, without a sense of a higher power of God imaging the human. And so what we're left with today is just fragments of a tradition. Maybe the phrase God's law, but disconnected from that broader tradition, from Douglas to King. And I think for those who are more skeptical about Clarence Thomas, this might be what you see in him, right? Just a fragment of the tradition that he pulls on without seeing the robustness of the sort of philosophical, political, theological ideas that all of these figures in the tradition had. So you might say today we're at a very, it's a sad story, the tradition has collapsed, Black Lives Matter seems like a secular movement, and Black Lives Matter certainly, right, there's no language of natural law circulating there. But there actually is a lot of religious language circulating around the movement for Black lives, whether it's language of spirit, language of love, right, or language of dignity. Right? This is language that has a political theological background that's just being repressed, just like those words are repressed at the King Monument. And so I think we ought to be, when we hear dignity being in the first sentence of the platform of the movement for Black lives, we can fill in. There's a political theological and a Black political theological tradition of reflection on dignity. In which you're positioning yourself, even if you don't know that, and that can offer guidance. That can offer guidance for your talk about justice that can help you avoid problems and turn in the right direction.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you very much to the Loeb Center, to Nikisa and Sam, and everyone who has put all this together. A little reluctant to follow that up. But the title for my talk is On His Right Side or His Left. On October 31st, 1986, Scotland Yard raided the London home of J.S.G. Boggs and arrested him on charges of counterfeiting the British sterling note. Boggs, as it turned out, was an artist who drew his own versions of local currency and traded these drawings for goods and services. Over time, these renditions became increasingly absurd, such as a note for $10,000. Those receiving the drawings knew full well that Boggs was paying them in fake money, but the British authorities were concerned all the same. In the trial that followed, a jury acquitted Boggs, and his drawings became the subject of gallery exhibits. In fact, after the trial, the counterfeits had become more valuable than the exaggerated amounts he had originally drawn on them. Boggs' experience is comparable to efforts of American scholars to draw their own versions of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., trading with willing audiences counterfeits that were worth more to their political objectives than the original. Perhaps the most valuable forgery is the one a little over a mile from where we are today, the Martin Luther King Memorial Stone of Hope. It is, after all, a grandiose yet saccharine depiction of King as the moral leader of our nation, surrounded by quotations drained of the sweat and blood he poured into them during years of Christian worship, political marching, and lonely weeping. Visitors begin their experience by walking in a gap within the Mountain of Despair, or two large blocks carved from what's called shrimp pink granite, with King's quotations inscribed on either side. The quotations seem strategically chosen to deprive visitors of insight into his faith, his celebration of the Declaration of Independence, and his demand for radical economic justice. No doubt, these choices were out of concern for offending some of King's visitors. Non-Christians perhaps would not approve of the biblical glosses. Foreign visitors may not have liked the patriotism of King's celebration of the Declaration. Political conservatives might not have liked King calling for the radical redistribution of wealth. However, the outcome of these several compromises is a counterfeit. What could be more obvious a fake than a king who does not provoke the conscience? The name of the King Memorial is Stone of Hope. King appears as though he were carved from the Mountain of Despair, thus referencing King's statement about hewing out of the Mountain of Despair a Stone of Hope. Li Yixin, a survivor of Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution, depicts King's crossing his arms and holding in his left hand a rolled-up piece of paper containing a speech, or a sermon, or a magazine. When first unveiled, Critics immediately noticed that the inscription on King's back was inappropriately vain. The line was a botched paraphrase, "I was a drum major for justice, peace, and righteousness." King's famous 1968 sermon, "The Drum Major Instinct," actually read as follows, as it was eventually replaced. "If you want to say that I was a drum major, say that I was a drum major for justice. Say I was a drum major for peace. I was a drum major for righteousness. And all the other shallow things will not matter." Perhaps the greatest mistake, however, is where King is looking. Like the many statues of Mao, King is looking ahead. He should be looking up. After all, in a few short sentences after the line inscribed on his back, King pleaded, "Yes, Jesus, I want to be on your right side or your left side. Not for any selfish reason. I want to be on your right side or your left side. Not in terms of some political kingdom or ambition, but I just want to be there in love and in justice and in truth and in commitment to others, so that we can make of this old world a new world." The memorial is designed to tell the visitor that King is supposed to be the stone of hope. Yet for King, he was not the stone of hope. Jesus Christ was. In his speech before the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, King quotes Isaiah 40, which in the Christian tradition foretells Jesus as the Messiah. "I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places shall be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together." This is our hope. This is our faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. This version is the one that King gave us himself, but it is nowhere to be found in his memorial. The memorial is in fact perversely treating King as though he were a Messiah, which King would have regarded as both blasphemous and a vast overestimation of what he could have accomplished. How could a counterfeit this bad be the one entered into the American civil religion? The answer is that the American civil religion no longer permits us to remember the king for who he was. Instead, we are permitted only the counterfeit selected by a congressionally authorized foundation and paid for in part by the Walt Disney Company, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and George Lucas, the creator of the Star Wars franchise. I have singled out the memorial because it, like Martin Luther King Day, serves as certification of what Scott Hoffman has called King's overlooked canonization. The American civil religion is not any one set of beliefs. In 1967, Robert Villa originally introduced the concept in his eponymous article, and his account of the American civil religion was a political faith that ran parallel to the several religious traditions followed in America. The American civil religion remained mute on the precise nature of God, but affirmed that God was interested in the American experiment, was the author of our natural rights, and occasionally intervened in history to protect or punish us. For Bella, the holidays of the American civil religion included the Independence Day and Memorial Day. The chief priests were presidents, and its pantheon included the founders and Abraham Lincoln, although others may qualify. Recently, Philip Gorski has sought to revive the mid-century American civil religion as a source for political consensus, but this effort confuses cause and effect. The American civil religion is a byproduct of religious disestablishment. The multiplicity of faiths in America prompted a constitutional prohibition on a national religion. As a result, these many faiths have had to find a consensus of shared values, despite often contentious relations over matters of deep religious importance, such as the storied fights between the New York Irish Catholics and Anglo-Protestants. As John Wilsey has argued, the American civil religion relies not merely on occasional speeches from presidential high priests, but on the regular ministry of American preachers who must negotiate alongside congregations articles of faith with the necessity of participating in public life. As Wilsey said in American Exceptionalism and Civil Religion, churches have served as agents of the civil religion to support and advance it. American clergy do not serve in political offices as an extension of their ecclesial role, but they have historically served as mouthpieces for the civil religion nonetheless. The American civil religion, therefore, is in regular flux as these negotiations produce different results over time. For example, the single most important shift in the American civil religion was a movement from Protestant hegemony to the inclusion of Catholics and Jews. When looking at Calvin Coolidge's speech on the 150th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, one finds that the traditional Anglo-Protestant story that locates the origins of American republicanism in the English Reformation. However, as Mark Silk, Matt Hedstrom, and Kevin Schultz each have separately illustrated, this view declined during the 20th century as liberal Protestants, scandalized by the violent nativism of the revived Ku Klux Klan, sought to form inroads with Catholics and Jews. The result was what has become known as the Judeo-Christian tradition, or as King called it, the Hebraic Christian tradition. In 1955, at the time King began his public ministry for racial justice, the United States was at the height of its post-war religious revival. King assumed the leadership of the Montgomery Improvement Association only 2 years after Venerable Fulton J. Sheen received an Emmy for Best Television Personality as the host of the religious program Life is Worth Living. Reverend Billy Graham appeared on Meet the Press and led the storied Scotland Crusade for Christ. Only a year before, then President Dwight D. Eisenhower had begun his Back to God program, pronouncing whatever our individual church, whatever our personal creed, our common faith in God is a common bond among us. And our fundamental faith, we are all one. And only a few years before Eisenhower, Rabbi Joshua Lough-Liebman had published his bestseller, Peace of Mind. When King spoke to his audience then, he sought a way to draw from a united religious consensus rather than among the various racial divisions. Hence, he often spoke of the Hebraic Christian tradition in which Catholics, Protestants, and Jews held a broad set of principles that bound them together in a uniquely American set of democratic values. When King spoke, he spoke as a Baptist minister, and his condemnation of racial segregation rested on his Christian faith. He said in his sermon, "Why Jesus called a man a fool, that before I was a civil rights leader, I was a preacher of the gospel. This was my calling, and it still remains my greatest commitment. You know, actually, all that I do in civil rights, I do because I consider it a part of my ministry. I have no other ambitions in life but achieve excellence in Christian ministry." However, King was also a keeper of the Hebraic Christian tradition, on which the American Declaration of Independence and Constitution were grounded. For example, in a 1962 speech before Governor Nelson Rockefeller, and a detail I find very amusing, Cardinal Francis Spellman, I'm the Catholic on the list today, King preached, especially if you know something about Spellman, in the final analysis, racial injustice must be uprooted from American society because it is morally wrong. It must be uprooted because it stands against all the noble precepts of our Hebraic Christian heritage. The Declaration of Independence and the Emancipation Proclamation deserve to live in sacred honor. Many generations of Americans suffered, bled, and died confident that those who followed them would preserve the purity of our ideals. Often overlooked is the nominal audience for King's letter from Birmingham jail. It's the white, Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish clergy of Birmingham. Riffing on Galatians 3:28, King said during his March on Washington address, "When all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last." The audiences jumped to their feet in applause and carried signs that read, "We march together, Catholics, Jews, and Protestants." King's moral vision of the nation was the beloved community which operated as a Hebraic Christian covenant, founded on the sacrificial love revealed in the person of Christ. One example includes an aforementioned Paul's letter on American Christians. This is absolutely one of his best writings, by the way, so I was very excited to hear someone else talk about it. Speaking as though he were St. Paul, King addressed America thusly, "The greatest of all virtues is love. Here we find the true meaning of the Christian faith and of the cross. Calvary is a telescope through which we can look into the long vista of eternity and see the love of God breaking into time. Out of the hugeness of his generosity, God allowed his only begotten Son to die that we may live. By uniting ourselves with Christ and your brothers through love, you will be able to matriculate in the university of eternal life." On the authority of the Hebraic Christian covenant, King publicly judged elected officials by this standard and often found them wanting. such as his year-long call to President John F. Kennedy to institute what King called, the Second Great Emancipation. The allusion to Lincoln was intentional, as King also judged the heroes of the American civil religion by the Hebraic Christian tradition and found in them signs of human imperfection, but always with a struggle to do justice. Lincoln, as King often reminded his audience, was a reluctant emancipator. Thomas Jefferson authored the Declaration of Independence with its appeal to political equality, but as we all know, he also owned slaves. They suffered, and the partial redemption they earned was enough to usher in another stage for racial justice that King called for Congress, presidents, and American people to heed. For King, heroes of the civil religion, like Jefferson and Lincoln, were heroes only because the Declaration of Independence and the Emancipation Proclamation were political applications of the gospel that would, he hoped, establish a more perfect union in the foundation of sacrificial love revealed by Christ crucified, resurrected, and ascended. To that end, King advocated for political equality for African Americans, the political independence for former European colonies in Africa and Asia, the end of South African apartheid regime, and a halt to the conflict in Vietnam. In domestic politics, he believed that political required reparations for African Americans who alone had suffered illegally enforced enslavement, treatment as commodities at the slavers' market, and after emancipation, paramilitary violence against newly enfranchised freedmen, lynching and race riots, Jim Crow segregation, literacy tests, and poll taxes.
Say it.
In an often forgotten or unread chapter of 1964, Why We Can't Wait, King compared the conditions of African Americans to those of post-war Europe and the American GIs coming home. One received the Marshall Plan, the other received the GI Bill. And what he called a Bill of Rights for the Disadvantaged, King called for a massive program by government of special compensatory measures which could be regarded as a settlement in accordance with the accepted practice of common law to provide remedy for the appropriation of the labor of one human being by another. To preserve the economic support that reparation would start, King called for labor unions to integrate there's your joke, Sam. The subsequent defense and protection of those unions and assert the interest of workers against the immoral excesses of capitalism. He called the alliance between civil rights and unions not a matter of choice but of necessity. Since if Negroes have almost no rights in the South, labor has few more, but two together could not only improve the lives of African Americans, but poor whites in the South as well. It should be obvious from the proceeding why only counterfeit kings can find a home in the American civil religion. For the right, King made an explicitly religious argument for racial integration to a then deeply devout American population. This king is the king celebrated in the book by King's former attorney and longtime friend Clarence V. Jones, who in 2008 published What Would Martin Say? And argued that King would have condemned contemporary civil rights activists, opposed existing affirmative action policies, and somewhat more strangely, George W. Bush's 2003 intervention in Iraq. Jones's strategy is to apply King's words on one subject and imagine how they might be applied today, an interpretive device that is frightfully prone to bias. For the left, King offered radical critiques of democratic capitalism, insisted on a powerful and direct role for the national government in economic redistribution, and recommended African Americans as especially deserving of redistribution based on their unique historical circumstances. This so-called radical king has surfaced in recent years as an answer to the conservative king offered by Jones, among others. For example, in his contribution to the volume To Build a New World, Paul C. Taylor expresses distaste for King's religious faith and recommends that secular Americans artificially separate King's political claims from their religious foundations, thus enabling scholar activists like himself to claim King as his own. Taylor admits that this king is, in fact, as he uses the term, a counterfeit, explaining that treating the counterfeit as real has its benefits. The secular counterfeit is more interesting and offers, paradoxically, more precise questions. After all, the counterfeit can be more helpful to the radical political ends that Taylor sets for King, provided that Taylor does not pass beyond the point to which critical encounter descends yet into error. Yet, the standard for error appears to be acknowledging the link between King's Christian commitments and his politics. The irony is that Jones and Taylor may not agree which counterfeit to use, but they both agree to use counterfeits. The fight here is not over whether one side or the other has the right king, but more of a battle of the brands. in which both sides more or less admit their political motivations supersede any commitment to honoring King himself. It is easy to see with this battle raging, those behind the King Memorial sought to honor King without taking sides. They did not wish to be on King's right side or his left side, so they put the historical King on the sideline. It is this historical King to which we should commit ourselves to learning. And his excellent response to Jones, G. Russell C.A. Jr. wrote about the place of Martin Luther King Day in the liturgical calendar of the American civil religion, and he concluded that the same thing that I've included about the statue. While C.A. and I may disagree over the development of King's political theology, I agree with him that the degeneration of King from a national icon to an inane symbol is a tragedy, one which will only worsen if, in C.A.'s words, we allow the historical King to become so inaccessible to future generations that it makes it impossible to produce others with the same commitment and dedication to the transcendent ideals that make this nation great. I would only add that these transcendent ideals emerged from the Hebraic Christian consensus, without which neither a once nor future king could emerge. During the Christmas of 1967, in a period some wished to see King as his truest and most radical, King gave a 5-part radio address for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation in what was later published under the title Trumpet of Conscience. He said then, as he had said in almost his same words throughout his entire ministry, the following, with its allusion to John 3:19. If there is to be peace and goodwill toward men, we must finally believe in the ultimate morality of the universe, and believe that all reality hinges on moral foundations. Something must remind us of this as we once again stand in the Christmas season and think of the Easter season. Simultaneously, for the two somehow go together. Christ came to show us the way. Men loved darkness rather than light, and they crucified him. And there on Good Friday on the cross it was still dark, but then Easter came, and Easter is an eternal reminder of the fact that truth crushed to earth will rise again.
Come on, say it.
The greatest memorial to King will not and cannot be his statue on the mall, but our commitment to the same sacrificial love he demonstrated in speech and action for his all too short life.
Come on, God. There you go.
So I want to say how honored I am to be given this opportunity, and I thank Professor Tooley, Professor Goldman for putting this together, the Loeb Institute. I really just want to share a pained reflection. And I'm glad to do it on a day when King has been so celebrated. And so much that is good and noble, heroic and sacrificial about his life and faith has been said. But we shouldn't have a counterfeit king. And he was a deeply flawed hero. Tragically, I think, flawed. And I choose to speak about this, as I said, because this is a day when everyone has heard so much about what is good. And I can be permitted to mourn where he fell short. It's also, I think, a very appropriate time to talk about it. With the Catholic sex abuse scandal that broke in the early 2000s in Boston, our own beloved Cardinal Law, Jean and I owe much to him, was very, very deeply implicated in the wrong that was done by at least 5 priests who were shuttled around and their wrongdoing covered up. Men of the cloth whom people trusted and looked up to took advantage of innocent children. How dare we as Christians hold our heads high in an age where that is true? And it was only the tip of the iceberg. Sydney, Australia, Ireland, Chicago, California, most recently Pennsylvania. How tragic. It doesn't matter that I'm not a Catholic. I'm a Christian. How tragic. Or on the other hand, white evangelical support for Trump. 80 82% of them voted for him in this election. All of their standards about what you needed to be in order to win their support went out the window. They voted for a man who had been married 3 times, who cheated on various wives, everyone knew. Even after, it's so funny, my right-wing beloved family in Jamaica, bemoaned the breaking of the Access Hollywood tapes, saying it was all over. Only, I said, no, this is America. It wasn't all over, was it? Not even the Access Hollywood tapes, where the man talked about sexually assaulting women, relished the thought. Not even then, not even that was enough to turn white evangelicals back. I understand the Supreme Court, but really, at what price? At what price? At the price of really selling out the very reason why it would matter that you had a Supreme Court justice to stand against abortion or to stand for biblical marriage. What is the point if you have so tarnished the name of Jesus that everybody thinks it deserves to be thrown in the trash? So we turn to King. What a man. What a towering moral figure. Such principled opposition to materialism. He had this very deliberate lifestyle that was extremely modest. His wife, long-suffering wife, his wife railed against it, right? I mean, King earned enormous amounts of money for speaking engagements, which he gave to SCLC, and kept a very modest amount for his family. He took just $1, according to Garrow, according to David Garrow's excellent autobiography of King. He took just $1 as his salary from SCLC, and that was really so his family would qualify for health insurance. He took very little money from Ebenezer, where he was pastor. So this was a man who didn't just talk about capitalism, didn't just say what the nation needed to do, but lived it out sacrificially. When his wife complained about where they lived, he insisted it had to be a modest home. He did give in and finally buy rather than renting, but it had to be a modest home in a modest neighborhood. The man lived sacrificially, but it wasn't only there that it was sacrificial. Every form of economic oppression he was against. He stood up to criticize the Vietnam War when those voices around him were like, what are you doing? You're going to turn the president against us. What are you doing? But he stood up despite all of the hostility, because the hostility wasn't just from the Johnson administration, but also from the public. He went on to lead the Poor People's Movement, even though he was aware that his funders were falling away, he was losing popularity, and he went to Memphis knowing that he was risking his life. He went to Memphis to stand with those garbage workers, knowing he was risking his life, as is evident in the mountaintop speech. What a man of character, of purpose, of sacrifice. And of course, his opposition to racial oppression. Risked his own life time and time again. And as someone who, and the conviction of the Holy Spirit, moved into a dangerous neighborhood, raised our children there, I know it was even more difficult that he was putting his wife and his children's lives at risk. Bombs on their porches, which they narrowly escaped being hurt by. How difficult. It's one thing to take your own life in your hands, but to take your children's life, your wife's life, and yet he was courageous and pursued it. What is more, he wasn't just doing this for some unknown reasons. It's been convincingly shown here today that he was operating out of moral conviction, out of the belief that there is a God. He believed that Jesus appeared to him, that he had a vision in his kitchen. From that vision, he drew strength time and time again. And yet, the massive infidelity. We're not talking about one woman. Okay, so there were marital problems, there were tensions in his marriage. And he's flawed, right? He wasn't the Messiah. And I mean, this account is clear he wasn't the Messiah. So you think maybe he found comfort in one moment? No. According to Garrow, incidental couplings were commonplace in King's travels. One-night stands. But it's not like it was just a, complete frustration of the moment, because he has 2 or 3 long-term mistresses. He has 2 or 3 long-term mistresses. In fact, one of them actually goes on to write about the fact that she was his mistress. She publishes her autobiography and proclaims it.